Good afternoon. Welcome to Sonorities 2024, to the third of 4 symposia. We've got some treats for you today. We have Professor Eric Lewis from McGill, philosopher, musician, improviser, refuser of easy categorizations, who's joining us on Zoom. Eric is no stranger to SARC, and we're delighted to welcome him back. We have Landon Morrison, who, despite the Sonorities website, is, I'm informed, newly installed as a professor at Eastman School of Music in Rochester.
Yeah, still in London through the fall, but yeah.
And we're very grateful that he could be here in person, presumably thanks in part to his connection with Andrew McPherson's research team at Imperial. I note several keywords in his abstract which already have made me excited. So, mess, partiality, entanglement. I think there are going to be interesting things to hear from and to say there. And my colleagues from Queen's, Matthew Rodger, psychologist, improvising musician, an inspiration for many fruitful personal arguments, and Bonnie Smith, his colleague from psychology. I'm going to do my best to leave the floor to them while ironing out any awkward pauses, or perhaps I'll just leave them in. I'm going to invite them to speak in sequence, keeping the questions, and I hope that's the point of this subsequent debate for the end. As I read out the titles of their presentations, I hope you'll get a sense of why we've programmed this particular group of people together. Eric Lewis will speak on a microchip off the old block, Emergent Minds in Human-Computer Interactions. Landon Morrison's title is Improvising Intra-actions in the Design and Use of Digital Musical Instruments, a Partial Perspective. There's another of those words, partial. And Matthew Rodger and Bonnie Smith will talk about the aesthetics of new musical instruments and the improvisational ecologies through which they co-develop. There's another of those words, ecologies. Eric, are you there?
I am there.
Over to you.
Thank you.
We look forward to this.
I fear mine is not a partial perspective, but maybe simply an incoherent one. We shall see.
Don't believe a word.
I'm really sorry I couldn't be there in person. I see so many familiar faces, old students, old colleagues, most importantly, old friends. So I apologize again, but I am coming to you from McGill University, which is situated on the traditional territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka unceded lands. I, of course, don't have to tell anyone in Belfast about the impact of colonialism. Obviously, the details are different, but these are things we should continue to interrogate. What I want to talk to you about today is very much work in progress, although it's things I've been thinking around the edges of for quite a while, and perhaps after this session, it'll no longer be work in progress, but can go into the largest computer file I have on my computer, which is stupid ideas I once toyed with. So let's see how this goes. And my thinking in this area started when I realized that, at least from my perspective, there seems to be an often unmentioned and unresolved tension between improvisational studies as a discipline grounded to a great degree in humanistic studies and the social sciences on the one hand, and improvising machine research, which is conducted, as you all well aware, often by folks coming from more purely musical or technical backgrounds. And the tension is based on the one hand, one of the fundamental principles to arise out of improvisational studies in the last, 30 or so odd years, is to see improvisation, and collective improvisation in particular, as essentially a social phenomena, as being a site of dialogue between agents, where, among other things, one is engaging in the transmission, contestation, construction, and negotiation of identities, subjectivities, histories, and meanings. All right, so if you think something like that or some bit of that is true on the one hand, you then, of course, have improvised machine research, which often starts with the assumption that machines can improvise in principle And the idea is, of course, to develop machine systems that can do so and do so effectively. Now, the tension, of course, is it therefore appears that you need to be committed to the claim that machine systems can enter as full participants, as agents into the sociality that defines collective improvisation, if these machines are to be actually improvising partners as opposed to merely some sort of simulacra of them. But of course, claiming that machines can be agents, and in particular social agents, faces a number of serious and long-standing objections. And it would be nice if we could have an account of the manner in which our improvising machine partners are just that we are actually improvising with them and that they are improvising with us, without having to answer a whole series of incredibly difficult, knotty, and long-standing questions concerning machine subjectivity, right? On the one hand, it'd be nice if we don't have to have that sort of account. On the other, it would be nice if we don't have to reject the essentially social nature of collective improvisation. So what kind of options are there? Well, it appears to me there are two dominant responses to this dilemma. On the one hand, ignore it, which is perfectly fine. We don't all have to take a stance on all issues that might arise in the disciplines and practices that we're engaged in. And this is the attitude taken quite rightly by a number of folks who design improvising systems, right? I'm not going to worry particularly about the kind of metaphysics and philosophy of what it is to improvise. Look how my machine system, look at what it can do, and you decide how you want to describe that. On the other hand, a response that I see as becoming more and more popular is to sort of embrace what often comes under the rubric of various sorts of post-humanistic models of agency and action, which no longer privilege out of the box humans as agents or actors, and in effect level out differences between humans, machines, and environments, viewing them simply as an unreflective form of anthropocentrism. This is a kind of view which says there isn't really a problem here, right? It's only our kind of anthropocentrism, which thinks only humans have a certain kind of agency or sociality. Machines have that out of the box as well as anything else. For me, this latter move, as popular as it is in some circles, kind of throws out the baby, the soap, the towel, and the bath along with the bathwater. It is a much more revisionistic ontology than is sometimes recognized, and it's one whose ethical and political implications are sometimes ignored. And it seems like this position is sometimes taken because it literally just solves a whole bunch of problems out of the gate, right? Assume this position, now you don't have to worry about a whole bunch of stuff, including, say, the status of improvising machine systems with respect to their role as actual agents, right? From this perspective, this line of thought claims that machine systems are just like me, an agent, a social creature, someone with intentionality, maybe even thoughts, beliefs, and desires, but other than me, unlike me in other ways. Why? They're made out of, integrated circuits and motion sensors and video cameras. In other words, the differences seem to reside primarily in the material domain, and the claim is this is not actually pertinent at the level of the allocation of agency, action, desires, and intentionality. I'm suspicious of such moves, or at least I think such moves are premature at a bare minimum, if for no other reason than their radicalness is often downplayed, as if all we have here are terminological issues. And I've spoken to a lot of, some of my graduate students and things who seem to think this talk of agency, intentionality is just kind of terminological problems. I'm also suspicious because it looks to me like there are other alternatives available. such moves ignore the copious theory and literature on collective action, collective agency, and collective intentionality. What can we say about collectives that include machine systems? How might they help us understand what's going on here? And they often tend to ignore new trends in cognitive science, which conceive of hybrid human-machine systems as sometimes forming a single cognitive system or function, often under the rubric of what's called 4E cognition. Yet if improvising systems are not just like us, but other than us, how can we endorse their potential as improvising partners? Now, in a book I wrote, oh God, I don't know, 7 years ago, something like that, I thought about this question for the first time. My case study was a system many of you will be familiar with, George Lewis's Voyager. I considered that system for two reasons. One, because many people thought it, quite rightly I think, it produces quite convincing sonic outputs in the context of collective improvisations on the one hand, while on the other hand, its creator, George Lewis, is of course someone who has strongly advocated for the essentially social dimensions of collective improvisation. So I was kind of thinking, well, George, he's all about the social, he's designing these machine systems. What does he himself think about the status of these machine systems in collective improvisations? And there I argued that machine systems do not, in fact, have to be just like us. We don't have to conceive of them actually as having agency and intentionality, but we do need to imagine that they are just like us, to in effect take what's called the intentional stance in some of the cognitive literature and philosophical literature towards them. And this move from them actually being X to imagining that they are X actually has more implications than might be apparent. What I want to do today is explore another possible avenue of response to this problem. Improvising computer systems are not just like us, but can either be, in a sense, parts of us. The way that your iPhone, when you store phone numbers in it, may be part of your cognitive memory system. And more radically, perhaps, there are occasions where perhaps both we and an improvising machine system can be best viewed as parts of a new emergent agent or mind. And I'll have to be very sketchy here, and I'm sure I'll learn a lot about ways to think about this from the ensuing discussion. The moves we need to think about both involve models of collective agency and intentionality, where there's now quite a rich literature, and models of 4E cognition, and crucially bringing these two into dialogue with each other, where I want to argue that the kinds of extended minds that seem to best characterize what might sometimes be happening in collective improvisation have other features that suggest moving actually to an emergent mind model to make sense of the complex entanglements of extensions that are taking place. So the argument in a nutshell, and I'll have to be very sketchy today, is something like this. Collective improvisation is a paradigmatic case of group intentionality. Group intentionality is often thought by folks who theorize about it to imply group agency. The particular group agency at play in collective improvisation is grounded in it being a complex of mental extensions that are taking place. Each member of the ensemble is both outsourcing some cognitive functions to other or tasks to other members, musical cognitive functions, among others, and they're taking on the role of playing the cognitive tasks of others. Such networks of extended minds, when certain other conditions are met, these conditions are both contentious and complicated, suggests the presence of an emergent mind. In other words, a system that is best described not as an example of what is called in the literature we agency or we intentionality, but an emergent form of I agency. And in such cases where machines are part of the complex, right, machines operate essentially as parts of this emergent mind the same way the humans do, serving both as extensions of others and having others enact some of their cognitive processes. And in that sense, there's nothing problematic about machines as improvising partners because their status in this emergent system is analogous to that also of the humans. So in such cases, machine status in improvising collectives is essentially the same as that of humans, regardless of what view you might hold about machine intelligence or personhood. You don't have to take a strong stance about that. So I just wanted today sketch a little bit of this and see what those of you in the room who come from so many overlapping but diverse disciplinary backgrounds might suggest for how to think about this. So first, just on collective or group intentionality and emergent minds. Collective improvisation can be seen fairly easily as a paradigmatic and complex example of collective intentionality. When we improvise together, we seem to share certain intentional goals, and it's best described that there's a kind of collective intentionality that is at play. An analysis of collective intentionality in the context of group improvisation suggests the application of what's called in the literature a non-summative account. That is to say, were you to know the intentions of every member of the ensemble as they unfold in time, you couldn't therefore glean the intentions of the collective simply by somehow adding these all up, right? The collective intentionality is distinct from the sum of individual intentions. And the literature here is quite vast. It tends to look both at small group behavior, but even at entities quite larger that we attribute group intentionality to, like corporations or states, right? You're not going to figure out what IBM intends simply by knowing what every single person who works for IBM intends and just sort of putting a plus sign between all of it. Claims made by advocates of non-summative accounts of collective intentionality suggest, when applied to collective improvisation, moving to an emergent model of agency by saying that there's sort of an agent that is present who has these attentions that is not merely the sum total of, say, the human agents that constitute the collective. And such an emergent model can incorporate machine improvisers as part of the network, underlying them, the kind of emergent mind, and so functionally treat them just as it treats the human improvisers, as necessary components for the emergence of the particular mind that may emerge. And I should say at this point, if there's any truth or value to the kind of model I'm sketching today, it is not intended to hold true of all collective improvisations at all time. I think a mistake that often takes place in this literature is striving for the model, right, that is meant to account for all phenomena of group improvisation. We should be suspicious of that in general. If we've learned anything from feminist theorists of collective improvisation, critical race theorists of collective improvisation, is that there are many ways collective improvisations might unfold as particular practices, and it's highly unlikely we're going to have a one-size-that-fits-all model. What I'm hoping is the kind of model I'm sketching today might explain what happens some of the time in certain cases. Well, why in general endorse collective intentionality even as a real phenomenon? The best reason is we often and unproblematically ascribe intentions to collectives and groups, right? We talk about what they intend, and crucially, based on what we take it that they intend, we draw predictions about future behavior, right? And these predictions are only ever accurate if we assume there is a collective intentionality. We could never figure it out if we said we need to just know about the intentions of all the agents that constitute a group. In other words, such ascriptions have explanatory and predicative power. And we even endorse this legally. I mean, whether we think we should or not is another matter, right? We talk about the intentions of corporate entities, and indeed often rights accrue to them precisely because they are thought to have collective intentions and therefore have the status legally of agents, right? And the explanations and predictions we make cannot be gleaned just from the intentions of individual members. We even ascribe beliefs to collectives, right? We say things like, IBM believes that, right? The government of England believes that, right? And these collectives, for which we describe both intentionality and beliefs to, often include machines as essential parts of them, right? Remove the machines from these systems and you would have different beliefs and intentions, right? Or you couldn't actually satisfy the conditions where these beliefs and intentions can be acted upon. And some folks have started to apply this model to collective improvisation. Lucia Angelino has discussed this in terms of an analysis of Charles Mingus's group's performance of Folk Forms #1, right? Where she says, in spite of some stylistic differences, the phenomenon in question here is not reducible to the actions of any of its single members, nor to the sum total of all the juxtaposed actions. She says, you couldn't possibly understand how this performance and improvisation unfolds just if you have access to each individual musician's real-time intentions. So some conclusions from this. Non-additive collective intentionality theorists are often willing to characterize cases of collective intentionality as states where, as it's often put, a plural subject emerges, right? There is now a subject here, where a collective acts as one body, as it's often put. What prevents this very same reasoning from grounding a commitment to an emergent mind, which may well include machines as its parts, since among other reasons, we naturally take unified bodies acting in a seemingly coordinated way to be doing so to their control by a mind. What I'm getting at here is people who work in this literature are often comfortable concluding that there is kind of a subject that has emerged, a body that has emerged, but they often fall short of claiming that therefore there's a mind that has emerged, which strikes me as a bit interesting, since we often think that if you have a single body that is acting as a subject, it does so because there's some central coordination that's going on, and we normally attribute that central coordination to being the function of something we call a mind. Now, this is sometimes put under the rubric of what's called we agency, right? So the question is, under what conditions, when you are yourself engaged in a group activity, are you likely to move from saying, I intend to we intend to? Right? And the claim usually is that agents must not just be able to predict the consequences of their own actions, both at, and here I'm quoting from Kashiri, How Does It Feel to Act Together? There the claim is made, it's not enough just to predict what you're going to do and what the consequences will be. You need to do the same for the actions of your co-agents, and finally integrate both self and other predictions to build predictions about the joint consequences of combined actions. And when your ability to do this, when you have the ability to do this, then you tend to claim that there is a sense of we agency at play, right? The strength of the sense of agency for the joint outcome will depend upon how accurately one is able to make joint predictions, which in turn depends upon the extent and accuracy of self and other predictions and on the manner of their integration. And folks who've thought about the kind of real-time phenomenology and thinking involved in collective improvisation will see how this is an account that should be brought to bear to that. What you're constantly doing is what you're thinking about doing, and you're also responding to what other people are doing. You're trying to predict what other people are doing, and then you're trying to figure out what might result from this, and if X results from this, what are you likely to do further down the road? And the greater degree to which you're able to do this seems to be the greater degree to which you think now, as an improvising ensemble, we are accomplishing something collectively. Now, collective improvisations, as I've just said, seem to have all the hallmarks of this form of collective intentionality, yet seem to lack predictability, which strikes me as interesting, right? You're doing all these things as a player, right? You're thinking about what you've just done, what you want to do, what other folks are doing, how that implicates what you might want to do now, what they might be doing next. I wonder when the bass player, how long they're going to keep playing that repetitive riff, you know, et cetera, and so forth. But still, even all of that has it that both to performers themselves and often to audience members, you can't predict what's going to happen next. If you were able to predict what was going to happen next, there's a certain sense in which you could just get up and leave the room, right? You would know what's going to happen without having to be there for its performance. Yet it also doesn't appear to be random, right? The behavior doesn't seem to be, if you can't predict it, it's not because it seems to be random behavior. And this lack of predictability from the inside suggests that there isn't just a form of we agency, but there's a singular form of I agency, which is distinct from the agency of each of the individuals. Its predictability by members of the collective itself is a hallmark of we agency, is therefore ruled out, as is the summative account of individual intentions to produce accurate predictions of the unfolding of the improvisation. Yet intentionality still appears to be on the scene, right? It doesn't seem to suddenly be an unintentional activity. Then the door is open to it being a kind of I intentionality, where the I is the collective itself, considered as a single intentional agent. And this may seem to be an extreme view to take if you're just worrying about the literature about collective agency and intentionality. But what I want to suggest is, and sketch this very quickly, if that literature is brought into dialogue with new advances in various models of cognition, we may be able to see our way to why an account of claiming collective improvisation, sometimes as a form of emergent I intentionality, might be one worth pursuing. And this is here where I'm going to bring in just what's now very familiar to folks who work in this area, the notion of 4E cognition. Cognition is being both extended, cognitive processes is literally constituted by an extra bodily process. The classic examples of this are things like, you used to memorize your friends' phone numbers, now you store them in your phone, and your phone is an extension, a physical extension of your cognitive memory system. It's embodied. Cognitive processes are partially constituted by processes that are not just in the brain, and it's both enacted and embedded. Different people describe these slightly differently, but both of them have to do with the fact that our cognitive processes both determine things in our greater environment and are determined by them. What you can do cognitively is a function of your environment, and your environment itself is often altered by cognitive processes that you might engage in. Collective improvisations, and I am getting just to the end, involving machines, seem to have all of these features, right? Imagine a collective improvisation where Voyager, say, is one of the improvising agents, we might want to say. Well, we offload cognitive processes to others, including the machine. You may just say, the machine is keeping the beat here in time. I don't have to do that, right? I'm busy doing too many other things. Sometimes it used to be maybe the drummer and the bass player would do that. Now, the machine system is doing it. The reasoning takes place in spatially dispersed parts, right? The reasoning is taking place once we realize it's embodied in bodies, limbs, lips, and machine parts, right? Our improvisational reasoning creates new possibilities and constraints on our environment. What you do in the ensemble creates possibilities and constraints on what others can do, including the machine systems. And improvisational reasoning is equally constrained and facilitated by our environment, right? What other folks are doing, places, practical, aesthetic, and other constraints on what you can do or may want to do. But I think there's more that suggests moving from a complex network of extended, embodied, enacted, and embedded minds towards a single emergent mind that's the proper subject of I-intentionality. So you might stop and say, okay, we've got this really strange complex here. My mind is being, extended into yours and others in the collectives, and yours is extended into mine. And really what we have is this complex network of extended minds, and there's all these feedback loops going on because of the embeddedness and the enactedness of this all, and this includes machine systems. I think, and I think the literature here suggests when networks of extended minds get so complicated and have so many feedback loops between them and include certain other detailed features that authors in this area don't all agree precisely what they are, it suggests moving to an emergent mind hypothesis. Some of these considerations are this: they involve non-functional equivalent expansions of the mind. That is to say, when I offload some of my cognitive work onto the collective could now do things I couldn't do on my own. And you could see how machine systems might be able to do that. So it's not simply that I'm having you act as part of my mind because I'm lazy. It now allows new cognitive functions to be discharged that I couldn't do on my own. There are these complex feedback loops between a given improviser's mind and that of others. The environment of the whole offers affordances and avoidances for each individual. And then to move to a slightly distinct literature, improvising collectives can, of course, be expressive. We apply expressive predicates to their musical output, even if each individual's contributions are not. We say the sum totality of the sound that was produced was expressive of X. And we can't glean this simply from the expressiveness of what each individual participant's contributions might be. An expression is normally taken to require an agent that does the expressing, which is another reason to move to a form of I agency at play. In that sense, and this is the end, improvising collectives act far more like individuals with agency, intentionality, and creativity than as a group of individual agents, even a coordinated group. And so by accepting that in such cases, one might have a case of a single emergent mind, machine members of the collective can play the same role as human members without you having to decide first that they're acting as agents or the bearers of intentions or personhoods. There certainly was sometimes put in the literature that the supervenient space for the emergent mind can include machine systems as easily as it can include robust flesh and blood human agents. While the machines on their own may be just that, machines, when accepted as members of a highly social, closely knit, and mutually interactive community of improvisers, they can transcend their mere machine status and form parts of a single emergent mind. And I shall stop there. I hope I didn't go over too much. And again, for me, this is all very early and suggestive work, and I would love to hear what directions folks think either it should go or perhaps shouldn't go, or whether I should just put that in the file of stupid things I thought about at various times and should now do something different. Thank you all.
If that's early incoherent work, we have a lot to be frightened about, really. So thank you very much, Eric. We'll just take a minute while Landon sets up a different screen regime for his straight on, if we don't mind.
I do want to say what a great group of folks I see out there. I wish I was there. Hello to many of you who I recognize.
Okay, I think I'm all set up.
The floor is yours.
Great. So it's good to be here today in Belfast. Talk is titled Improvising Intra-actions in the Design and Use of Musical Instruments, a Partial Perspective. And I just want to say at the top here that my approach to improvisation in this talk is a bit more figurative perhaps than literal in terms of a musical improvisation context. So it's improvising across disciplinary boundaries, improvising between theories as a kind of cultural interface as well, and then trying to bring a bit of a few examples at the end here which actually do get a little closer to home on the topic of improvisation. So I thought I would start today by explaining my title, and in particular the last bit, which references a partial perspective. So what do I mean by this? So for starters, I mean that my presentation today was extracted from a much longer paper that I co-authored with Andrew McPherson for the upcoming CHI conference, which is next month. So what you're hearing is partial in relation to our full argument, which unfolds in the form of what we call a diffractive dialogue. So here we're borrowing an optical metaphor of diffraction from post-humanist theorists like Donna Haraway and Karen Barad, which they pose as an alternative to reflection, and which is meant to provide a way of reading different perspectives through one another and attending to the production of interference patterns between them. So in this sense, partiality also denotes the limits of my own knowledge and disciplinary background, and it speaks to our collective pursuit of what Haraway describes as situated knowledge, which aims to avoid the so-called God trick of, quote, seeing everything from nowhere. So to wit, Andrew is an engineer and an instrument designer, while I am not. I'm a music theorist who's also interested in media and cultural studies. So we came to this dialogue with different frames of reference and expectations and with no goal of reconciling them. Instead, we wanted to juxtapose our viewpoints, so we engaged in a writing game, and this is something we actually borrowed from Jonathan Stern and Tara Rodgers, who did something similar at a conference that I saw last year. So as part of this writing game, we traded impromptu prompts and responses every day for a 2-week period, sort of back and forth on a Google Doc. This brisk back and forth allowed us to suss out the space between our respective positions, which continue to develop and come into focus through our collaborative interactions, or to borrow another neologism from Barad, through our intra-actions, by which is meant the mutual constitution of entangled agencies, and this would be opposed to the a priori existence of individual agencies outside of any relational context. Now, our dialogue unfolds over the course of 5 sections in which we examine Haraway and Barad's post-humanist theories and what they might mean for the field of human-computer interaction, or HCI, and more specifically what it might mean for the design and use of digital musical instruments, or DMIs, I'll refer to them as. In recent years, HCI researchers have attempted to derive actionable design methods based on such theories, and particularly Barad's theory of entanglement, leading some to declare that we are now in the midst of a new wave of so-called entanglement HCI. So today I'd like to spend some time tracking this wave, examining some of its theoretical tributaries in other fields, and drawing attention to sources that have, to date, remained at the edges of this discourse. I'll be pulling material primarily from sections 2 through 4 of our CHI paper, and for much of the talk I'll be playing in the register of theory, though as I said, I'll try to get to some concrete examples toward the end. And with these examples, I'm hoping to illustrate the significance of relational theories in the analysis of musical instruments and their surrounding cultures of use, while also giving some consideration to artificial intelligence and machine learning applications, which are being used not only during performance, but in the design process as well today. So to begin, I think it's instructive to start with a reference to a general definition of entanglement from the Oxford English Dictionary, standard academic move, where we find it's got an inherent sense of relationality, but it's articulated to, quote, complicated or compromising situations, or else to barbed barriers, which are meant to keep things separate, not bring them together. Now, this primarily negative connotation has been inverted in a lot of contemporary theory, and especially in Barad's work, which instead resonates with a more specialized use of the term from quantum physics, where it calls to mind subatomic particles which are acting on each other over great distances. Now, from there, we find an explosion of the term's usage across a wide range of research domains, including archaeology, anthropology, philosophy, social sciences, even management studies, and many more. Of course, the field of music studies is no exception here, and the language of entanglement has been put to work, albeit to different ends, in scholarship by Eric Clark, Joanne Cho, Kevin Fairbairn, and our chair for today's session, Simon Waters, among others. While the precise meaning of entanglement continues to drift as it filters through these different fields, there seems to be a consensus around the idea that it challenges binary thinking by denoting a sprawling interconnectedness between subjects and objects, humans and non-humans, materials and ideas, nature and culture, and so on. Now, in the specific case of entanglement HCI, authors like Christopher Frauenberger have attributed this new wave of research to a bundle of what he describes as, quote, entanglement theories, bringing humans and non-humans onto the same level within a relational ontology. These include Barad's agential realism, as well as object-oriented ontology, actor network theory, and post-phenomenology. But the work of Barad remains paramount, as evidenced by the adoption of their terminology as a banner for the whole movement. While Frauenberger is not alone in noting the proximities of these theories, such a big tent grouping risks eliding key differences between them, so I want to take a minute to contrast each of these approaches with that of Barad's. Now, perhaps the most obvious conflict is between Barad's relational framework and the object-oriented ontology of authors like Graham Harman, which is by definition not relational, but rather focused on the essences of things in themselves. Indeed, whereas Barad insists that distinct agencies do not exist as individual elements outside of their constitutive intra-actions, Harman is determined to, quote, recover the autonomy of things occluded by the recent relational turn across the humanities. He thus rejects what he calls the duo-mining of objects, that is, either the undermining of them through an emphasis on their constituent parts, or an overmining of them by emphasizing their impact on other objects as part of a larger network or system. So clearly this view is at odds with Barad's emphasis on entangled agencies, and in fact with the whole school of new materialist thought, against which Harman identifies himself, perhaps surprisingly, as an immaterialist. I can try to circle back to this during the Q&A if there's questions. So the other two theories fare better, as they're at least relational in their outlook, though still with important differences. So compared to Barad's jumping point of quantum physics, the actor network theory of authors like Bruno Latour emerged from a sociology of science, and it was intended as a method for tracing associations between humans and non-humans involved in a shared program of action, such as conducting experiments in a lab. Now, this difference is underscored in a 2011 review of Barad's book by Trevor Pinch, who argues that, quote, using science to bolster a view in science studies is a dangerous game, and one that, quote, courts a form of scientism. Out of this conflict flow other problems, such as Barad's anti-representationalist stance and their assertion that, quote, language has been granted too much power, which runs headlong into Latour's emphasis on actors or actants, with their attendant scripts, modes of delegation, and translations of intentionality, all of which are integral to his semiotic analysis of science in the making. So finally, the post-phenomenology of authors like Don Ide seem to be closest to Barad's agential realism, as both approaches peg philosophy to an interest in empirical evidence, engaging different versions of realism, instrumental in Ide's case, agential in Barad, and emphasizing the relational co-constitution of subjects and objects. But again, we should note a few caveats, which include the frictions that arise between Barad's fundamental decentering of the human and Ide's assertion that, quote, all knowledge possible for us implies our embodiment, which points to a preoccupation with the epistemological conditions of being and having a body. We might also note Barad's rejection of reflexivity as, quote, nothing more than iterative mimesis, mirrors upon mirrors. This is hard to reconcile with Ide's interest in bodily modes of reflexivity, their transformation via techniques, and the way in which, quote, embodiment is reflexively implied in science instrumentation. Now, all of this is to say that if, as seems to be the case, a fourth wave of HCI has been influenced by these different strains of thought, then contributions from each need to be assessed on their own terms and not subsumed into an overly broad category. Moreover, by subjecting the varied approaches that make up Frauenberger's bundle of so-called entanglement theories to this kind of diffractive analysis, we can uncover several fissures and fault lines, opening space for not only interrogating their association in HCI literature, but for suggesting new theories that might be better for reorienting contemporary design practice towards more critical and political approaches to technocultural mediation. Indeed, this would allow us to recover reflexive and representational and constructivist modes of critique that have been too hastily dismissed by new materialism, and which, as queer phenomenologist Sarah Ahmed notes, often offers a, quote, caricature of the turns in recent theory, and which in fact runs the risk of reifying matter into a, quote, pure theoretical object that reintroduces the binarism between materiality and culture that much work in science studies has helped to challenge. Now, to date, it's still unclear whether the critical perspectives around gender, race, disability, and more that have been cultivated by third wave research in HCI will find similar support in the new entanglement HCI paradigm. And as Eva Giraud argues in her recent book, What Comes After Entanglement, insights gained from Barad's agential realism need to be balanced against what she calls a, quote, ethics of exclusion, which pays attention to the entities, practices, and ways of being that are foreclosed when other entangled realities are materialized. This seems like sage advice for HCI researchers and designers who may still be getting their bearings in new materialist literature, as it allows entanglement theory to be situated as part of an ongoing discourse, diffracted through adjacent lines of thought in sociology, psychoanalysis, post-Marxism, post-structuralism, political phenomenology, and other standpoint philosophies, as well as a host of fellow travelers in science and technology studies, or sociology of scientific knowledge, and more. Without it, appeals to entanglement HCI will likely lose their critical orientation to questions of knowledge, power, and technological influence, and will instead lapse into a non-reflexive narrative of designers who no longer make things, but instead design entire networks of interaction, as though they somehow stand outside of these relations and have the ability to control or foresee how people might remake or reappropriate their technical inventions. So, with the time I have left, I want to shift away from abstract theory to focus on what all of this means for analyzing the design and use of digital music instruments. In doing so, I'll be drawing on a range of theoretical approaches closer to my own areas of research in music, media, and cultural studies. These will include things like new organology or critical organology, which, as posed by John Tretch and Emily Dolan, goes far beyond rigid taxonomies of instruments to engage with their, quote, material configurations, social and institutional locations, degrees of freedom, and teleologies. I'll also be drawing on software and interface studies, or drawing out an unintended, I think, Baradian resonance in Alexander Galloway's work, Intraface Studies, which is useful for thinking of interfaces not as things, but as processual thresholds between people and a simulated representation of the world that can be interrogated and subjected to close historical and cultural analysis. And finally, I'll incorporate ideas from critical infrastructure studies, which cues up a concern with the material and environmental conditions surrounding the production and distribution of musical media, as well as with the conceptual and informational systems through which these media circulate, and from which emanate all kinds of normative classifications. So let's take a familiar example, the by now iconic, I would say, Roland TR-808 drum machine, which, like so many of these devices from the 1980s, features step-entry programming for the composition of musical sequences. Now, in this way, the machine is predicated on the idea that musical time consists of a series of discrete steps that can be organized into rhythms and metrical patterns. We can see this in the interface, which lays out a series of 16 buttons, each of which corresponds with a unit of time in a musical measure, most commonly 16th notes in a 4/4 time signature. It thus encodes a hierarchical conception of meter and musical time that's based on metronomically uniform beats. The result of this arrangement is often crisp, cookie-cutter rhythms that are characteristic of many 80s pop songs and which continue to be prevalent in many styles today. So we hear them, for instance, in a live performance of Psycho Killer by the Talking Heads, which in this video, never mind the boombox, it's just placed there as a kind of visual prop. So I'll play a quick clip of this. It's very quiet listening, I hope you can hear. Okay, so the model here also extends extends beyond just programmed sequences to live performance through the use of quantization, which can snap real-time rhythms to an underlying metric grid in order to correct small microtiming errors, much in the same way that auto-tune is used for pitch correction. This is something I've written about elsewhere for those that may be interested in the history of quantization or how it's been received across different musical genres. Now we can think about the mapping of a performer's actions to an underlying representation of control by referencing critical interface studies, scholars like Wendy Chun and the aforementioned Alexander Galloway. For both of them, interfaces act as an allegory or an analog of ideological control by bringing users into relation with the virtual world of representation. As Chum put it, any kind of mapping is also a being mapped because it, quote, concretizes our relation to invisible sources and substructures. So in the case of a drum machine, we might think of how the contemporary musician or user is brought into contact with a hierarchical representation of meter, which actually stretches all the way back to the 18th century in theoretical treatises from the Western classical tradition, such as the one shown here, which is Johann Kernberger's treatise on accent theory, which lays out a kind of Newtonian model of temporality as a series of equidistant pulses that listeners are supposed to automatically segment and group into higher level metric formations. And yet, as Galloway notes, interfaces can also be interrogated, and critical approaches to interface design and use can also be adopted as a mode of ideological critique by drawing attention to the effects of mediations that may otherwise be concealed. So there is, in this sense, a kind of double valence to interfaces that tempers what would otherwise become moribund in a kind of technological determinism. We can hear this reframing of interface affordances in a J Dilla track, which jumped the gun for me. So the track there was Beach Indem, and here we're hearing rhythm quantization wielded against itself, and the effect is these kind of warped off-grid beats with skewed subdivisions working against each other, cutting against normative applications of the technique. Now, in a broader sense, the concept of mapping is foundational to the entire enterprise of building digital instruments. And the scheme usually goes something like this. You start with an idea of what music is, which in reality is only ever a particular style of music, and which comes attached to a set of concepts for describing sonic parameters that are deemed valuable in that style, such as pitch, volume, or timbre, which will need to be then converted into numerical representations. Now, coming from the other side, you'll build a digital instrument which may be outfitted with various kinds of sensors And these two produce a set of numbers, allowing you to then map the control signals to the predefined musical parameters. The result is a digital instrument that Philip Agre would characterize as a representational artifact, in that it models a version of the activity that it seeks to be used for. So such representations are neither good nor bad in any absolute sense, but they do pose problems when they become reified and start to function as a false objectivity for people that are unable to grapple with the historical specificity and the consequences of the distributed effects. And it's at this point, according to Agre, that a representation becomes, quote, constituted as a kind of imperialism because it aims to reinvent virtually every other side of practice in its own image. So one could argue that this is the case now with universal formats like MIDI, or more recently the advent of audio description standards like MPEG-7, which encode a particular representation of sound while posing as neutral intermediaries. This imperialistic possibility has become even more acute in the current age of AI and machine learning techniques, which has been marked by a turn to automatic methods for mapping sounds to gestural motion. So for instance, Rebecca Fabrink and her colleagues have proposed a model of what they describe as play-along mapping, where performers train a musical control system by effectively miming gestures along with sounds that are already analyzed to produce a computer-based score. Similarly, Jules Francois and his colleagues at IRCAM in Paris have developed what they consider to be an improvisative technique for, quote, mapping by demonstration. And this relies on automatic operations for mapping a performer's movement to a physical modeling synthesis engine. Now, to be sure, these approaches are revolutionizing, I guess, digital instrument design, and I don't mean to suggest here that they have no utility or they're inherently bad or always coercive. But they do appeal to a sense of transparency, which further obfuscates the fact that, like all mapping strategies, they depend on a particular representation of sound, and in this case, gesture, to determine what is musically valuable and thus expressible. So I'm left wondering what the influx of machine learning and machine listening in contemporary musical practices means for our ability to reverse engineer what are essentially black boxed algorithms. And I think this is crucial for understanding the kinds of ideologies that get embedded in digital instruments, as well as for finding space to leverage critiques against these ideologies, and ultimately for taking ethical responsibility for the specific historical and cultural representations that they perpetuate. And I think I'll leave it there. So I want to thank you for your attention, for listening, and I look forward to the Q&A / debate period. So, thanks.
Okay, cool. Thank you, Landon. And we now hand over directly to Matthew and Bonnie, who are going to share the presentation. Oh, you might have to reshare the screen. No? Oh, share. Mirror, re-mirror.
Mirror, yeah?
Yeah.
Great. Well, thanks very much for sticking around for the third talk of today's symposium. The topic, as you can see, is the aesthetics of new musical instruments and the improvisational ecologies through which they co-develop. There's a bunch of terms thrown in there, some of which we'll be able to do justice to, most of which we won't, but we'll try to unpack that. This is a presentation by myself and my colleague Bonnie. Paul's name is up there because he did contribute to the abstract for this, but he's absolved of any responsibility for what we were about to say, so I just want to make that clear from the outset. I think a useful starting point, we could pick a number of these concepts to start with, but a useful starting point is the idea of musical ecologies. So, To build up a sense of what we're referring to as musical ecologies, I want to start with the depiction here of an agent, a person, an organism, interacting with something that could be a musical instrument, could be a proto-instrument, could be an infra-instrument, all these sorts of things that we interact with that could do something sonically. As Dewey taught us, things begin with the act, so this is something that can be struck, touched, moved, and excited in some way. And if it's usually in the context of instruments, it's going to do something sonically as a result. So this gets us at the idea of the affordance concept, which is the dispositional properties of this thing to behave in a way in response to action by an agent, something that's a perceptual, motor, control, or coordinated process. Already we have a sort of miniature ecology here because this forms a system. The looping function between action and perceivable consequences, i.e. the affordances of the thing, the world, is what what music making is, effectively in a very sort of reduced, simple way. However, this is not itself enough to talk about musical ecologies because clearly this action and sonic response happens in some sort of environment or context. For example, the sonic lab, it could be a bedroom, it could be a concert hall, it could be anywhere, but that in itself is also something that causally shapes what's going on in the perceptual, motor, and sonic interactions of the agent and the affordances of the instrument or proto-instrument. And none of this is happening sort of as a snapshot in time. All of this is developing through time. So the interaction is situated in some history that occupies some or many histories potentially. So for example, I'm depicting this with the Byzantine bull player, but it could be any number of things. That this has, the interaction has cultural feels to it. It has physical feels in terms of expectations about how physical objects dispositionally behave in response to being struck, bowed, tapped, and so on. And there it also occupies a virtual future, which I've represented here purely through the logistic map, but the idea that there are places that this can go, that can bifurcate through time. There are, opportunities, there are possibilities. It can also die. It can also become extinct. It can also fail to develop as well. So there is a sort of virtual, but as of yet unrealized future in the interaction. So all of that messiness is what we're thinking of as musical ecologies, and all of these things we're going to argue interact or are entangled with each other, following on from the previous talk there. Also, because the title of the symposium is Human-Computer Improvisation, we have to say something about improvisation in order to get our check. So, I hope. In this context, we're understanding improvisation as the unscripted exploratory behavior of the musician or the agent, the organism, in contact with the instrument. This is not necessarily referring to improvisation as an improvised performance, but even just seeing, touching, hearing, feeling, moving through the possibilities and the possible affordances and the kind of the pathway that one could enact through them, we're understanding as improvisation with a small I. With that said, I want to say a couple of things about sort of affordances and their characteristics from using non-musical examples. So the first is to take a sort of local interest feature, which is Giant's Causeway on the North Coast. If you're visiting Belfast for the first time, get the bus up there, it's fun. This is a stone, sort of ancient stone kind of, natural phenomenon. And you have these hexagonal structures that can be potentially walked across, climbed across, clambered across, and so on. You can pick any pathway through that. You can go back on yourself. So you have here affordances for stepping, climbing, walking, traversing, and so on. And we have the possibility to concatenate those affordances through time in different ways, depending on whether you want to get from A to B or you want to play around or what have you. The point I want to make is that the affordances and their availability of these structures depend on who it is that is in contact or interacting with them. They're very different to a 4-year-old as to a 94-year-old, as to a parkour athlete, and so on. In a sense, talking about the traversability of Giant's Causeway is meaningless, independent consideration of the agent or the individual who comes into contact with it. And the same is true for talking about any property of an instrument. It is neither playable nor accessible nor fun, independent of considering the individual who comes into contact with it. Related to that, I'm using an example here, a depiction of a sort of reasonably featureless floor of a forest. The existence of many possibilities for traversal or for action does not also make them inviting, depending on the individual involved. Some people put in this situation would find this very daunting, would find they would get lost quite easily, and this is what we see actually when people do get lost in woods, is they often go around in circles, unable to figure out what the path that they should take through that landscape is. Just because an instrument affords lots of possibilities doesn't mean those are going to be explored and improvised through and taken up by anyone that's brought into contact with it. So again, as I say, just because something has affordance qualities does not make them either available or soliciting to that individual. I've introduced sort of the title, this idea of aesthetics, just because it's something we've been working on recently. I'm going to get into this, is the relationship between perceptual motor processes, which I'm going to sort of mainly focus on the idea of affordances and the uptake of them, and what we could think of as aesthetics. Here we're using this idea of social aesthetics, which is considering what are the processes by which something can have aesthetic qualities or lead to aesthetic experiences. There's an entangled, interactive, whatever you want to call it, bidirectionality between these things. In the first instance, perceptual motor coordination and the uptake of affordances in the environment can constitute aesthetic experience. That is that the discovery of the affordances of the instrument, the perception of them, which is necessary in order for them to be controlled or enacted, those things can co-develop instrumental practice and culture. To give you some examples, the discovery of the multiphonic dispositional properties of saxophones and the ability to enact and coordinate and control those and take those up is a key player in genres like free jazz. Likewise, the rediscovery of double-handed tapping of the guitar is a feature of classic and heavy metal and so on. So the discovery and enactment of those affordance properties of the instrument actually can shape the broader aesthetic and cultural development of the instrument and the genre of music in which they are put to use. Conversely, aesthetic processes and sensibilities can constrain, shape and affect perceptual motor ones. What we do with our eyes, ears and muscles and so on is at least in part dependent on aesthetic and cultural ideas. So social cultural forms in which instruments are interacted with, whether they be, I say, sonic labs, concert halls, bedrooms, town centres and so on, and also particularly the past experiences of the individuals who are doing that interacting with those social cultural forms can affect which affordances do solicit action, i.e. those which are taken up and affected, but also how they're taking up, the way that coordinative processes actually get the affordances to be enacted. So we have research on this. We don't have research. I can cite research on this by Sophia Dahl, where she looked at the motion capture recordings of snare drum playing by musicians of different cultural backgrounds. Some were rock drum kit players, some were orchestral side drum players. And for the same task, for the same action, for the same affordance being enacted, the kinematics and the sort of stick movements, arm movements, wrist movements, elbow movements and so on of the players are very different, and it aligns with the genre in which they've learned how to extract the affordance of the hitability of a snare and do it in a concatenated, nested way. So again, here the point is that aesthetics, like what looks or sounds good for, say, rock or orchestral performance, and the actual coordinating of joint rotations and the muscular commands entailed affect each other as well. So hopefully that then sets me up to hand over to Bonnie to talk a bit more specifically about some actual research.
Hello everyone. So I'm going to describe some of the work of my PhD thesis to kind of illustrate what the concepts that Matthew was talking about. And so essentially what I'm going to be discussing is how perceived sonic aesthetics have shown to influence interaction and engagement with new digital musical instruments. And so my research is generally exploratory research that investigates the effects of timbre on timing accuracy, gesture choices, meaning making with new DMIs for players of different backgrounds and levels of expertise. So here I'm going to describe only one facet of my research, which relates to timbral aesthetics and their role in the development of meaningful playing experience. And so I'll just start off by describing the studies that we did, where we used a percussive DMI based on a string bridge plate physical model, which was developed by a lovely team in SARC here. For those of you who don't know, physical modelling emulates the mechanoacoustic behaviours of instrumental materials and their consequent interactive dynamics. And so this is why we chose physical modelling for our psychological research, because it's a very ecological way to approach sound synthesis, and has the potential to align action and perception of the player in intuitive ways. So what I did in 3 of the studies that I run for my PhD was compare 2 versions of the same percussive instrument. One with the physical model that had very physical timbral qualities and realistic response to action, which sounded like a resonating metal plate, and contrasted it with a very different timbral version made from tone clouds, which were also developed here in SARC by Trevor Agus. And tone clouds essentially consist of sequences of randomly pitched short duration sine tones, which are also randomly distributed in their relative temporal onset. So ultimately they sound, they don't have any physical tangible qualities to them. They're quite hard to decipher, and there's no clear references to them other than they sound quite digital and synthetic. So the amplitude envelope produced by the physical models was used as the amplitude modulation parameter of the tone clouds, and therefore the synthesis preserved the physical model's response to input action whilst containing a very digital synthetic timbre. So we can actually hear some of the examples of them here, I think.
Do you want the video or just the sounds?
Just the sounds is fine. So this was the instrumental setup. This is the physical model. Just to give you an idea. And then the tone clouds in the second. So the participants in these studies were adult professional or expert musicians with varied different backgrounds in music and interests. And to complement this, we did another study with beginners, which is generally an underrepresented population in DMI research anyway, but that's kind of a different issue altogether. And the contrast of these results really highlighted the differences in needs, goals, and what constitutes meaningful experience as a result of practice and expertise. So the main findings of this research in relation to aesthetics have 2 main takeaways and 2 main points.
It says alignment.
It says alignment. And so essentially for a meaningful, engaging and self-sustaining aesthetic experience, there is need for a coherent relationship between the instrument's physical design, the qualities of its sonic feedback, and how it enables and embodies purposeful action. And so we can see this in this first quote, if you want to bring that up for me. Where we can really see that this alignment between instrument sound and action shapes how aesthetics drive and sustain engagement, particularly for beginners. And then another quote that really quite illustrates this diagram quite well is the one over here where the player describes the instrument as as opposed to the physical models, the tone clouds were not perceived as inherently percussive sounds. They didn't suit the interaction, so the act of rhythmic percussion, and they didn't suit the interface, so a surface that affords hitting. So this impacted engagement and overall player experience. So next over here, I think, is what leads us to our next section is perceived aesthetics are experienced at a sensory motor level and a perceptual level, so sound coherently matching action. But they are also shaped and influenced by learned associations from shared meanings that acquired in our environments, which leads us to this next stage where I talk about cultural background influencing perceived aesthetics and how this occurs at different scales. So it occurs from a more holistic cultural background, so in the sense, us being surrounded by Western musical norms, musical traditions, etc., or at a more subcultural level. So I think of punk versus classical musical genres, or traditional versus contemporary musical interests. And what is perceived as an aesthetic experience is therefore dependent on the background of the listener and the context in which the interaction is being perceived and experienced. And so there's another quote here that where a percussionist makes sense of the instrument by describing using his musical knowledge to explore the physical model, and that's how he went about that interaction. But in contrast to this, beginner musicians with very little musical experience struggled with exploration of the instrument, as they didn't have the resources to engage in purposeful musical interaction without scaffolding and guidance. However, playing experience for beginners was supported by aesthetics, whereby the physical model conditions helped maintain engagement as they provided an enjoyable experience, whether that interaction had a musical purpose or not. So actually in one of these quotes over here, you can see that some were describing it as non-musical, not for a musical purpose, but for the purpose of relaxation or meditation, because they associated that sound with those environments. And so ultimately, my point is here that instrumental meaning changes as a function of who is playing that instrument, and aesthetics are a fundamental part of creating a meaningful experience, which is modulated by the player's cultural background, experience, and their abilities.
Okay, so just to offer some conclusions from what we've said today. So the first would be that I guess just to state that perceptual motor processes and aesthetics are mutually entangled when we're looking at musical instrument interaction, whether it be both the available affordances and the manner in which they're taken up, forming musical cultures, or the way that musical cultures also shape the coordination processes of musicians. What we'd argue is that aesthetic experiences can certainly emerge from the interaction and the alignment of both purposeful actions, sonic feedback, and the instrument's design, and that can be a self-sustaining thing as well. It can also fail to do those things and not self-sustained. So there's not a guarantee that having those things together is going to lead to aesthetic experiences which do sustain interaction, but it may. That sort of looping between the instrument's dispositions, the structure and interface, and the purposeful actions of the musicians and so on, takes place within a social cultural context, and the interaction itself and its exploration and that sense of improvisation that we sort of highlighted earlier also takes place in that that cultural situation. And so we very briefly mentioned this idea we didn't even mention this idea of participatory sense making, but that is the process through which that instrument has meaning or comes to be meaningful, and it is one that is necessarily embedded in sociocultural practices and influences. And reflecting on the experiences of the beginners or the non-musicians, just having these things aligned and putting it in front of someone does not guarantee that any aesthetic experience, nor that there will be a self-sustaining interaction. These things are precarious in a sense and subject to forces, and the experience does matter. The sense in which exploration and musical activity and so on is familiar or inviting and so on really depends on the person. This is again not a feature of the instrument itself or the setting. It's an emergent property of those things in relation to the individual agent and possibly other agents as well. Oh yeah, so that's us.
Thank you both. But can we get Eric back on the screen? So thank you for 3 stimulating presentations, which started about as wide as you can get, narrowed in a little, and then kind of went like that at the very end. There's so much to pick up on. I'm going to try and shut up and not guide things, because that is my usual way. So can I throw things open to the floor? Questions can be general, or they can be comments, or they can be addressed to one particular speaker or whatever. Is there anyone who wants to start this thorny thing off? And please, would you speak into the microphone and make sure that you comment only into the mic?
Okay.
Martin.
Thanks, Simon. That was a question to Eric about the emergent mind concept. In particular, whether there are things that human agents or machines have to do, or stances that they have to take for there to be or arise an emergent, or for a mind to be emergent and become a single mind according to your concept, and vice versa, whether there are things that human agents or machines can do to undermine the emerging of a mind.
Great. Thank you. Sorry, can you hear me? I don't know.
Yes.
Come back. Yeah, great. I should preface this by saying I'm really drawing upon the criteria that other authors working this area see as the kind of standing conditions that where emergence might take place, and trying to apply it to improvising ensembles. And it is often thought to be a process which itself unfolds in time, right? So you don't start out of the box with a kind of emergent mind, but if the members of an ensemble start to relate it to each other in appropriate ways, these might be the conditions that can be the kind of supervenient space for emergence. And some of those things would be, at the most simple level, all the members need to be both listening to each other and responding, right? There needs to be these kind of feedback loops where simultaneously the musical contribution you're going to make is partially determined both by what you have just done and what other folks have done. Now, and we might add a whole bunch of other conditions. It depends precisely on which author you look at. I think for the case of improvisation, the important question would be, can a machine system engage in all of these kind of preparatory activities such that emergence might arrive? And depending upon which list you take as being these kind of preparatory actions, some systems may and other systems may not be able to. And this is where it might be interesting for people doing this research. Perhaps an improvising system that is not both taking in its inputs, analyzing them in a certain way, and having that partially determine its musical outputs, can't actually be part of an ensemble for which we might want to analyze what's happening as being a case of an emergent entity. A system where a member of the ensemble cannot really impact the kind of output of the machine system based on what it's doing might also be a condition that in its absence, therefore, you can't have the machine enter into part of the emergent mind. Is that the sort of things you're interested in, or you were thinking of?
Not really. I'm only started to think about it now, really, and maybe not next week. But it does interest me. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, what I'd be interested in is what others think these conditions might be, and what implications they might have for improvised machine design, right? If you take seriously that is partially the goal of designing such systems, that they can integrate into the collective in the way that the humans integrate into each other, such that you might get, even if you don't go the whole way, cases of collective intentionality, collective agency, and may perhaps ultimately emergence of a certain sort. I don't have a strong view about what all those are, except I know it's variable with respect to what theorists account of what needs to be the case about the interactions between members of an ensemble, such that you might then be in a position to have emergence itself emerge.
So I have a follow-up question for you, Eric.
Me, okay, great.
I'm curious. I mean, so I'm hearing a lot of sort of riffs on phenomenology in your talk, and I'm thinking of like sort of old school phenomenologists that were making critiques of AI and information process. Some like Hubert Dreyfus, for instance, would be one, or even today in the media studies landscape, someone like Alexander Galloway has been making arguments around the idea that computers can never have a phenomenology, so to speak. They can only ever kind of reside at the level of formalism. So can you contextualize this for us? Like, has there been a kind of progression in the philosophical thinking on this, that they are now more ready to accept these kinds of models from extended cognition, or from the 4E models that you referenced, or even the kinds of sort of inroads that AI and machine learning are making in the improvisation scene?
Sure, thanks. Yeah, I would be very loath to talk about what, my philosophical colleagues writ large might think about this. My own reasons for starting to think in these directions at all was precisely to think if there's a way of avoiding having to take a strong stance on these issues, right? So I think it would be really unfortunate if before I go off and design an improvising musical system, or choose to improvise with the musical, a machine improvising system, I have to have resolved a lot of these knotty problems in phenomenology and agency writ large. One thing that I like about these emergence accounts is, strictly speaking, you don't have to conclude the machine part of such a system has some sort of robust phenomenological reality to it, because what you're ascribing the kind of phenomenological properties to is the emergent mind, and it's not merely the additivity of all the minds that form the collective, right? So additivity models are the ones that force you to say, if a machine system is part of that, it has to have a kind of robust phenomenological existence just like the humans do, right? Because that's what allows you to throw it into the additivity mix, right? The emergent models sort of just allow you to say, well, look, what we're properly ascribing these capabilities and attitudes in phenomenological terms to is this emergent agent, right? And the machine is part of it the same way I might be part of it, right? So it's precisely to avoid having to sort of, put a flag in the sand and say, I'm a post-phenomenologist of this sort, or I'm a new materialist of this sort, that these kind of models are attractive to me. Maybe that's just because I don't want to have to do all the hard, heavy lifting to decide these other questions. I feel like, those are above my pay grade in a certain way. But to put it in other terms, we don't want to sit around and wait for those problems to be solved until we get our soldering irons out, right? So that's another reason why I was trying to think, is there a way we could just say, these problems may be solved in the future, or maybe will never be solved because they may ultimately be based on different kinds of philosophical, dare I say it, aesthetic attitudes. We take to certain kind of philosophical ways of thinking. If we can avoid that, the better. And it appears to me, at least, these accounts don't force you to take a stance on these questions, which you quite rightly are asking. Has there been a sea change, amongst philosophers or amongst phenomenologists or what have you?
Hi, I'll try and make this quick, but I just wanted to share a few thoughts. A lot of them were based on a lot of things that you had said. My name is Jim. My research and hopeful PhD is sort of about speculative fiction, so sci-fi and fantasy in audio drama and sound art. But I think the kind of so I'm just going to share a few thoughts that sprung to mind. It might be a bit of a mess, but hopefully it's kind of interesting. I think the kind of conclusion, or what I'm really interested in now from hearing this, is I was talking to this free jazz pianist, Pat Thomas, about kind of low latency streaming technology, and I'm really interested in what that might do for kind of subcultures online and improvising. And with that photo of the 808, I was reminded of Laboria Kubonic's Helen Hester's xenofeminism and her idea of repurposing technology. So she talks about telephones and how they were kind of repurposed by housewives. And, you know, you can look at sort of acid house and technoculture in the same way. You know, 808s were kind of thrown away, you know, before they kind of revolutionized dance music. Technological determinism was interesting, and also normative applications of technique makes me think of cultural hegemony. Also reminded me of that really cringy and kind of horrendous Brian Eno quote where he talks about African musicians not going anywhere near computers because they're not in the body enough, and how that kind of he did say that, and how this kind of relates to sort of Hegelian notions of kind of Africa kind of as sort of frozen in time. But interestingly, I learnt live coding on this course called Algo Afro Futures, which was kind of ran by and for black musicians. Also reminds me of Stockhausen's dialogue with Aphex Twin and some of the things that they were saying to each other. And also some conversations I've had with Charles Hayward from this heat. He sort of describes avant-garde music as folk musics. And so I'm just, so those are just a few scrambled thoughts, but I'm just interested in, you know, in kind of subcultures and sort of fandoms online, and what sort of low latency streaming services might do for kind of sort of global improv. That wasn't really a point, just sort of some general thoughts that popped in my head.
Anyone want to address the online low latency global improv issue?
What fix it?
Eric.
I'm happy to let other people talk first. I've been running forth here, if anyone wants.
So this is your pay grade.
Just in terms of people, just talking to. Oh, just in terms of like a group mind and an agent in there. I was kind of thinking, if three people got together to have a cup of tea and they boil the kettle and the kettle's boiling in the background and it pops up and the water boils at a certain time and surprises them, what's the difference in a kind of ritualistic event having a tool versus mind and a machine that's been designed to be representational of maybe a speaker, if it was people having a conversation? I don't know if that's a question, but it's just like, why do you have to pick a certain model of group mind over some other model, or why is that your choice?
Sorry, was that
I'm just throwing it out there in terms of what's a tool. Like if you're looking at a painting, it's made up of paint and it looks like a landscape. If you design an agent that's like playing improv like a jazz player and giving you back like feedback and responding to what you're doing, is it not just a tool in a ritualistic event that links a conversation? And that's my I only want a reaction to that. I'm not telling you something. I'm just throwing a thought out there. Yep.
So I could say what some folks who work in this area want to say. And ritual does enter into considerations here, because one thing about ritual is it tends to put fairly strict affordances and avoidances on behavior, right? You're expected to do this. It would be very odd were you to do something radically different. That affects one's ability to predict collective behavior. So one thing people have written about is it's precisely in ritualistic settings that we agency tends to come to the fore. People engaging in rituals feel like they are doing something with others, right? and not simply acting as individual agents. And that's often thought to be due partially to the heightened sense of predictability, not only with respect to people's own actions, but the actions of others. So, and these are cases where you have very tight feedback loops between what one member is doing with respect to what other people are doing, right? And this could be really creepy, right? You watch, films of mass Nazi rallies, right? And you get this sense of there's kind of this single entity which is acting with respect to a kind of collective intentionality and agency, precisely due to the ritualistic features. And you could be certain folks who want to have the loss of sense of individuation and are interested in having individuation subsumed into group behavior, for that reason do foreground ritualistic settings precisely for that reason. Why we don't describe, therefore, all examples where folks seem to be doing something together in those terms often depends on the degree to which there is or isn't coordination of intentions, desires, outputs, and how complex these feedback loops are, which is why you might think it's a little different between, every morning I wake up and I make you a nice cup of tea and I put it down on a tray next to your bed and you say thank you and I say no problem, right? Why isn't that such an example? Well, it might be, right? But it might not be, because it may lack some of the complexity of the cognitive offloading, which is characteristic of the kinds of cognitive extensions that often take place. What's curious in this area, there was a lot of research done which seemed to show a lot of men were suffering from early onset dementia. And there's a lot of work that was done on gender and dementia. And then they realized there was a flaw in the experimental design. What was actually the case was something that was much more gendered, which is men who became widows suddenly forgot, like, the birth dates of their children, right? The names of their nieces and nephews. Why? Because that knowledge was held in their spouse's minds for them, right? So these were literally cases of mental extensions, right? And then their spouse would pass away and they seem to now be demented, right? So, and they actually had to revise this research in this area. They're like, they're not demented. They just were treating their spouse like their iPhone, right? I don't know if I could return to the low latency stuff, but maybe others should.
If it goes there, we have another question. But just before we go to the next question, I'd like to pick up on this we agency, I agency thing, because I was interested that you appear to have presented that as a binary, and now you've just given us a really good example. I'm being picked up by this. All right. Now you've just given us a really good example of what I would say is an in-between of we agency and I agency, which is what I would call I and I agency, or something else. I'm sorry, that's a bit.
This is Rastafarian agency.
Yeah, not intended, but you know what I mean.
Okay.
The idea that there is something, dare I say it, related to community, which is not well defined by the notion of a we, but is not merely the addition of a series of component I's, if you see what I mean. It seems to me that as I was listening to you, the thing that I was worried about was your opposition of a we agency to an I agency as something absolute.
Sure, thanks.
Okay, we'll come back.
Again, one thing I'd like to avoid is these kind of one model fits all examples, right? And the ways in which individuation and collectivity might be related to each other in ways that impact notions of agency, autonomy, and ultimately, therefore, identity are going to be quite complex. And I think our tendencies to think of them as either ors, as it's I or we,
Yeah.
if we're gonna like paint with a very broad brush, are kind of cultural intellectual artifacts of a form of Cartesianism, right, which starts with the atomistic I, right, and then generates community as some sort of additive function of I's. Where if you look at other identity traditions and political traditions, many of them emerging out of, say, the African diaspora, which take the collective as the primitive, you're then going to have a very different account of how you generate I's from the we, right? So I think I'm happy to say, yep, that's perfectly fine. And indeed, that might be something that allows us to make sense of other kinds of collective practices. Maybe that's something which would be more at play with very long-standing improvising collectives, right? One thing that we all know phenomenologically, like in the world of free jazz that I come out of, you perform often with people for the first time, right? You show up, you shake someone's hand, you engage in collective improvisation. It sounds different, right? If you've been improvising even in a free setting with the same people for 5, 10, I have some people I've been improvising with for 25 years now. Maybe this is a case where it's more of an I sort of analysis that might be helpful in explaining the collective behavior than an emergent I. My view is, let every flower bloom when it comes to trying to explain these things. And it would be a mistake to think otherwise, right? We know from, feminist theory of improvisation that collective improvisation can often be dysfunctional and reproduce hierarchies. And that's going to demand a very different analysis at the level of collectivity and collective intentionality. What happens if there's one person whose intentions and reception of what's happening is radically different from the others, right? So we need to be able to have models that explain all of these things, and often the differences in the models may be grounded in the different social, cultural, and politics that are at play in these cases.
Hello, Eric. Can you hear me okay?
Okay,
Just
yes.
to be clear, that microphone's for the online stream.
That's what I
but not
think.
Eric.
Yes.
Yeah.
So
I
should-
Eric's the microphone's over there. So
should I just be louder?
Yes.
All right. My name's
I
Jesse.
always say I can't hear when I tell it's a hard question. So,
Okay. Good call. My name's Jesse. I'm also at McGill.
Oh, hey.
And I also wanted to talk about your agency slide because that set off a lot of things in my mind. For personal and selfish reasons, I've been doing a deep dive into a certain branch of neuroscience literature over the last 4 years. And the picture I'm starting to get of like the current state of that research is basically that we may have agency over some things, but we certainly know human beings don't have agency over other things. And the whole deal is kind of starting to approach a mechanistic model of how people work. And I thought that was very interesting that like my current understanding of human beings was more like how you modeled the machine part. And I was wondering what a mechanistic understanding would do if you were to admit it into your, or not admit it, but if you were to bring some of that into your, I just wanted to discuss it with you because you seem super interesting and I'm interested in that.
Sure, thank you. And I'm happy to take
That's
this
not a
up.
question, that's just a whole mess, I'm sorry.
I'm not sure all over a double latte at some point. We may be operating with slightly different notions of agency, and you may well know the neuroscience literature far better than I in this area. We don't usually talk about agency over, right, some other entity. Agency in this literature is really meant to be, in this sense, a self-reflective notion, right? You are either an agent or acting upon your agency or not. It's pretty easy, I think, to think of cases where both machines and or humans might have agency over someone else, and that might be itself either a machine or a human, right? Think to what degree many of us these days, and I'm old enough to, I'm going to say this about my children, right, who are already adults, right, how their phones have agency over them, right? If we're thinking about that sense of agency, that is to say, the mechanistic sense in which their behavior is often governed by in ways that they themselves might not always have access to the algorithms or rules that are being implemented, such that their own agency is being diminished and or direction mechanistically, right? And also it can work in the other direction. That's now that's interesting, and it, of course, to me, that relates to this literature here in the sense in which affordances and avoidances in collective improvisation might be the product either of the other humans in the collective, right? Oh my God, you know, the drummer is so great at keeping the beat without keeping time. I'm now free to do all sorts of things which I wouldn't otherwise, but it also could be discharged by the machine members of the collective, right? And in that sense, the agency over, as you put it, right, is one that both the machine components of the collective and the human components of the collective seem to be contributing to as equals, right? I don't know if that speaks to what you're interested in, but
yeah, if I'm understanding you well, it's basically just talking about different levels of zoom. Like if you're zoomed into neurons, agency looks like one thing, and if you're zoomed into an improvisation session, like it's a larger scale of agency.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes in this literature, there's this weird sense in which we're all still strange Cartesians that, you know, the neuroscientists do this really interesting work and they tell us it's happening at the neuron level here. And we all go, oh my God, right? As if we thought it was happening in the phlogiston or, you know, oh, I didn't know it was happening in my brain. I thought it was happening in my elbow, right? So it's not clear to me. I mean, we learn all sorts of stuff, right, from the neuroscience. It's not clear to me what we're learning that therefore impacts, in particular, in a sense that we have to jettison a certain line of thought to learn that at the neuron level or even lower than that, or this part of the brain's lighting up as opposed to another. It seems to me we sometimes act as if we're still surprised that there is a material substrate to this sort of stuff. Now, we know from embodied cognition that it's not all happening in the brain, right? We know particularly in collective improvisation, it's often happening, it's embodied knowledge. I don't have to think about running a chromatic run on my trumpet. My fingers know how to do it. I think they still do, right? But that in and of itself, unless it's embedded in a much wider story, right? About what does this have to say about agency, right? What does this have to say about intentionality is really just telling something we didn't know that's interesting and important, but not necessarily revisionary in any way, you know? So I'm often, I think you have to figure out what the moral of the story is from the neuroscientific results, right? And that they're not in and of itself somehow, well, now we have to throw all this stuff out. I'm like, I knew all, you know, I'm into the social, political, and cultural implications of these practices, but I still think shit's going on in my brain, right? You know? Sorry, that's a bit of crude editorializing, you know.
Spoken like a true trumpeter, because if you try and do a chromatic run on a trumpet and it doesn't work, it doesn't matter anyway, it still sounds cool.
So just to jump in here, we started a little bit late, so I hope you don't mind if we run a little bit late. I just want to come back briefly with a comment and then sort of a question for our other speakers that will curve back around eventually to Simon. Just a comment first, just to bring out this question around going back to the low latency or low, whatever we want to call low latency, because it's all relative. There's latency in between you and me right here, and the speed of light sending data across the internet requires, has a definite length, which means latency only can go so low, right?
There's latency between your brain and your mouth.
Yeah, as it definitely is right now, and it's bigger than ever while I've been running this festival.
That's quite tall. And I can tell you why.
Yeah. This like telematic music making or network music, this is something that we've been interested in SARC for a long time. We used to do it back in 2005, 6, 7, 8 out of curiosity. We then got thrown into having to do it again during the pandemic, somewhat against our will after we had gotten over the whole thing and moved on. I think so. John Bowers and I had a project called the final bit of it was how our suffering is multiplied, and we kind of looked at all the different ways we could connect online and tried to do them all at the same time. So turning on Jack Trip and Sonobus, but also Zoom and Teams, and had this proliferation of different mostly not designed for music, connection software, telecommunication software that just created an interesting cacophony that amplified the materiality of that online space. And I think it is as frustrating as it is as a way to make music for me, the kind of music that I'm used to making in the room kind of situated way. I think it is ripe actually for potential new forms of collaboration, new communities. So I think it's a really interesting, fruitful area. I want to ask these speakers to kind of riff on this idea in a sort of pragmatic way, and also drawing from the sort of diffractive perspective in Landon's speaking. So how, from the kind of materials that you're presenting, we've got this lovely sort of phenomenology meets 4E, extended mind kind of thing going on. We've got Karen Barad, new materialism. We've also got affordances, the Gibson ecological psychology perspective. We have Simon's, whose ecological thinking is well known, and also entanglement, but in both cases it's not the Gibsonian or the Baradian. So we have this interesting proliferation of different thinkers in the room. And so I'm wondering if, as a design prompt, can we imagine what an instrument would look like, what we could learn from your approach that you've given us today, or your model or your way of thinking, and pragmatically apply this to designing a new instrument for online improvisation across different communities. Simon, you have...
well, I have a thought on that.
And just so you riff for a second, but I wanted to start with Landon and then go Matthew, then Bonnie, Eric, and then back to you. But if you want to...
Just a quick thought, which is to do with where you get things from.
Yeah.
In Irish traditional music, it's one of the first things that you acknowledge. For example, I got this from Johnny whatever down the road, and I think that's important because there's also when I was in Helsinki not so long ago, sharing a stage with Don Idy, he asked me similar questions. He said, much more difficult ones. He said, "Where do you get your body from?" He didn't mean that like CNA or something. He meant where's this conceptual equipment from? And I think if we got a bit better, not in an academic way, but in a real way, acknowledging where our thoughts come from, it might be helpful to people. So one of the reasons my ecological thought isn't like the things that you talked about is that's not really where I got it, and the entanglement stuff as well. The first person I read on entanglement was Ian Hodder, who's an archaeologist. And that led me in a certain way of thinking, and in fact Don Idy's quite consistent with that, conformance with that in some ways. And if you know those things, it helps you understand a lot of stuff and not need to ask certain questions about it. Whereas the problem comes when we get into the sort of terminological thing of having to weigh one use of entanglement against another, and I think we need to live with multiple definitions a bit more than we do. I'll pass on.
All
right. So I don't know that I have anything smart to say about designing an online instrument, practical to say about that, since I'm not a designer. But you know, I was thinking about the low latency prospect that you brought up, and it does seem as though, I mean, I guess it's similar in a sense to the example I presented of J. Dilla, sort of reverse or refusing the kind of affordances of the interface and reworking them in some way. And I think that that's a key thing. I mean, one of the things I've been trying to be careful, at least, in parsing out my theoretical thoughts on this, is that it can easily become a kind of deterministic model if you don't allow for that, what Martha Ackerich in the STS world would call descripting, right? So if instruments are inscribed with certain or delegated to do certain things by their designers, that there is always another way of doing them that cannot be foreseen by that designer. And so there is no way to sort of control that or to step outside that frame. It's always a relational thing between a designer and a user in terms of how that instrument ends up being used. So something like turning a bug, like a latency, into a feature of the music, that the musical interaction seems in line with that. I guess the other thing I've been thinking about here, so like even in the kind of alternative frameworks I was raising, so new organology, sort of instruments, software and interface studies, and then infrastructure studies, there is even a tendency there for it to become a kind of, I don't know, a concrete structure in a way that feels more static than what I would like it to be. So, you know, the idea almost in a kind of Marxist sense that you would have like a base infrastructure which is determining the kind of instrumental superstructure and how those things get used. And I hear some resonances in new materialist thought, you know, this idea of everything being made of the same ontological stuff. There's a kind of totalizing view in play here that actually seems like it harkens back to the same kind of totalities that one finds in some post-Marxist theories. So there again, I want it to be more permeable than that, for there to be a kind of multi-directionality in the way that influence flows across those different, I wouldn't even call them levels really. I mean, again, it feels like levels because we're talking about surrounding conditions and thresholds and objects. But I'm even though I'm, I guess, suggesting that in some sense with the terminology I'm using, I want to find a way to get around it into something that's more of a flexible model and which does take account for the fact that instruments are not just ideological, they're not just determining, but that they can also be used for the reverse sort of ideological critique. And I think the other thing that I've been thinking about along these lines, I've been reading a lot of Raymond Williams lately, and he makes this point that, you know, determinism has a bad rap, right? You know, this idea that sort of economic or material base is determining these superstructure phenomena. It feels, you know, like a closed world on some level. So it does need to be multi-directional, and yet you can't really relinquish determination, because the minute you do that, the minute you stop thinking about determination, no matter which direction it's flowing, you're getting rid of the political stakes, I think. So I want to keep that within the frame of discussion as well. But
ditto. No, sorry. I think I think one of the things that could maybe offer, just from our perspective, or from my perspective, I won't speak on behalf of Bonnie, is that I think an analysis of what an online music interactive system affords is important. I think actually that analysis needs to be part of this story, because it seems to me that often what happens is that people maybe want that interactive network system to afford the same things that are afforded in the room together, i.e. hitting something, the sound appears straight away, or that they can synchronize together. We know from sensory motor timing literature that when you add latency things, people move slower, they start slowing down. So you're not going to get that. It does not afford that in the same way that a fork made out of like grass doesn't afford picking things up terribly well. So expecting it to do the same things that are afforded in other situations is not realistic, and it's frustrating. I think the inverse of that is that it may afford things that are unexpected or novel or that could be discovered, and there has to be an openness to that code, those potentially unexpected affordances or different suite of affordances, co-developing different practices, expectations, and vice versa. So the allowance for potentially subtly or potentially dramatically different sort of style or approach to making music in that setting, and discovering things through that and allowing that to be to have a life of its own. I think I think the affordance analysis requires that, because it ain't affording the same stuff, you know. And so if we don't take that seriously, you're going to be frustrated in what you can expect and what you'll get out of it. And it's not a bug. It's a feature to be explored and to be accommodated in the same way that, you know, humans and other animals have accommodated all of the frustrating non-affordances in their environment to do all sorts of different things. You know, the world doesn't show up the way we want it to. We act through it, and we discover and we explore and we find paths that were not obvious or that are now a path that wasn't before, and so on. So I think that would fall out of the approach we're offering here.
Thank you. I'm just you're last. I'm just going to add a very, very simple kind of outlook that I have, and from the perspective of the player and the user, and it just goes back to that idea that I was talking about earlier about alignment. So I think as long as you have, even in an online context, which obviously does afford very, very different things, and maybe a different range of things, and affordances that appear in a way that the designers didn't maybe intend. But I think ultimately, as long as there is that alignment between the interface that you're using, the goal that you have, and whether or not that's appropriate for what you're able to do as a player, then as long as you have those three things, even if it is on an online context, even if, as long as you can communicate that goal and communicate that creativity in that way, then as long as those things are aligned, then that in theory should work out even in an online setting, and it's just about adapting to that. And again, and maybe going back to another concept of being able to adapt an instrument to the needs of the user, and having something that is more or less complex in that context. And again, as long as the feedback aligns, so latency, all of that, as long as that is coherent with the actions of the user, then that I think that's a fundamental kind of element to that. So the purposeful interaction, so the goals of the user, the interface itself and how the interface is able to embody the goals of the user, and then the sound that it creates, so how the sound is able to also embody the actions of the user, and communicate that. Is that okay?
Yeah. Give a couple of examples. I want to pick up on this notion of adaptability and what community we're talking about. I'm part of the design team for the instrument called the Adaptive Use Musical Instrument, OMI, which is intended for folks with very limited motor control to enter into collective improvisations. And these are folks who, in a sense, have embodied latency, right? Their own cause and effect in the world, they have a very difficult time noticing, right? Because they don't change the world very much. And so there's a real latency between them doing something and them realizing that it was them who did it, right? So there's this kind of like latency built into their own agency. And for this reason, and I've actually written about this, I love latency in network performances. I don't want to get rid of it. It's my friend. I've been improvising with latency for years now. I'd be very sad. Why? Because I can improvise without latency all the time. I go down to my studio, I walk onto a stage, right? There's opportunities that latency creates which are not created in other contexts, right? And I'm often brought back to, there's this wonderful paragraph in Ellison's The Invisible Man, where the protagonist smokes a big spliff and listens to Louis Armstrong, the same recording on 5 different gramophones at the same time. And what you realize, given the time of the technologies, they're all running at different speeds, right? So he's listening to Louis Armstrong, hearing these 5 different latencies in dialogue with each other. And then he sort of talks about what the impact of this is on his phenomenology of hearing, right? Louis Armstrong. And I think we lose, if we don't explore those potentialities, we're actually losing something. I like latency and low audio signals in Zoom pedagogical settings. Why? Because if we reproduce the classroom or the concert stage perfectly, we're reproducing the power dynamics also, right? So in Zoom pedagogy, as it's usually the case, boys don't shout over the women because then the audio signal gets so bad no one can hear, right? Get a perfect audio signal and you get the same politics, right? So I think I want to think about latency as an improvising partner, not as a problem. And one way in which I think this implicates itself in these debates about improvising machine systems versus compositional machine systems, right? And I had this debate the other day. Imagine I design a system, a machine system where, and I call it's a composing machine, and you feed it a little melodic riff, and then it runs this processes, and 4 days later it comes back with a symphony, right? Some log scale structure. You say it's an improvising, you would say it's a composing machine system. Now, if you start shortening the temporal delay between it doing that, right? It's not 3 days, it's an hour. It's not an hour, it's 5 minutes. It's not 5 minutes, it's almost instantaneous. Now you say it's an improvising machine system, right? So how does the temporality come into play in revealing our prejudices or just thoughts or commitments to the difference between improvisation and composition, if we think there's any at all? So I think we lose an opportunity to think about all these things if we just say latency go away, right? I'll stop there. Yeah.
Great. We're not going to resolve any of this. That's not the purpose. I would take issue with some of what Bonnie said, because I'm an improvising musician, but I'm not a user, and I very often don't have any goals, and I strive very hard to get rid of them. And there are lots of experts in this room who are kind of exploring this area, and yet, looking for precisely the affordances of a system in which there are latencies which are unpredictable. But we may not recognize them when we see them. And the example that I have given before and wrote about at the end of a paper recently was a group of people, some of whom are in this room and many of whom are associated with SARC and that kind of work, who were sharing during COVID a sort of online dinner party and drinking situation, which, as these things tend to do, became a sort of online trying to play instruments together situation. And somebody picked up a mandolin, and somebody picked up a violin, and somebody picked up a guitar, and it was absolute shit. It just was awful. It was really not an example of how musicians interact, despite the expertise in all of the people involved in both interaction and music. Paradoxically, they then all started doing weird things like sort of videoing bits of each other doing stuff and rebroadcasting that into the ensemble of activity. And it's precisely that kind of ensembling which is my response to your question, which is a new form of sort of human social relations, which where machines are a necessary component part. We may not necessarily understand what they're doing, and sometimes it doesn't matter, but we have to recognize when the opportunities occur. I hope this was one for all of you. Thank you to Eric, thank you to our other speakers in the room for a really vibrant session. Vibrant session. I hope you go away with at least 3 thoughts that you hadn't had already. Thank you very much.
Since I can't be there and follow up with people over, beers or whatever, I'd be happy to communicate with anyone who might want to.